Essentially, what I'm going to talk about today is the effect of the built environment on the human unconscious, and my perspective is coming from cognitive neuroscience. So, main points of today. The first one being that I will show you a lot of examples of how architecture can be used to affect people's behavior and their cognitive processes. And for that, I will rely a lot on architectural psychology. And next, I will say a few things about us humans, living organisms, being processual organisms, and that we are constantly adapting and readjusting to our environments. And for that, I will rely on biology and philosophy. Don't worry, I will not focus a lot on this. I just brought 2 slides on this particular topic, but it's going to be very critical for your understanding in any case. So yeah. Next, I will say a few things about the difference between sensation and perception, because that seems to be the thing that most architects don't really understand. Like when I say I sense the room versus I perceive the room, those two things are extremely different from each other in cognitive science. But for architects, they're like, meh, same thing. No, they're not. And we have to talk about why they're not the same thing. So, and then I will say a few things about how you can measure some of these processes using cognitive neuroscience. I will only say a few things about that. However, my main point, and hopefully this is what you're going to remember after this lecture, is that I focus not so much on space, but much more on time. To me, architecture is about time. It is about how things evolve over time. It is how we adjust to things over time. It is not really that much about the space, because when you introduce the idea of time, you get a better feeling of the experience. So I know that this can sound a little bit abstract. So what I thought I would do is to bring with me a little thought experiment. And this is sometimes helpful for others to get a feeling about what I'm talking about. So you have to imagine in one parallel universe, you are here in space A. And this space A has very particular configurations, very particular size. Now you move from space A into space B. You guys can see my mouse, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So you move from space A to space B and you experience the space. Now, in a parallel universe, you started over here in a different kind of space compared to A. A and C are different. And now again, you move into space B. Now the big question is, in those two different scenarios, is your experience of the subsequent space, that is space B, the same? Is it identical? Is it similar? Is it somewhat similar? Are they different? Are they completely incomparable? Like this is something that most architects don't really seem to understand, because they talk about, oh, this space makes me feel a particular way. That means that my experience is attributed to this space alone. But in fact, when I talk about this kind of experiment, this kind of thought experiment, most people seem to respond that no, in fact, they have to be different. They cannot be the same. I'm coming from two very different spaces. That must have an effect on me. So just intuitively, just in our stomach, we can feel that these are two very different experience. And in fact, you can argue that before you came into space A and space C, you also started somewhere else before that. So when I talk about the importance of dimension of time, that what I'm meaning, what I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to convey is the development does not start from nowhere. You start from somewhere and you build on that somewhere accumulatively over time. Okay, so that was just a thought experiment, sort of to start provoking an idea about what I'm talking about. Okay, hopefully none of you know Robert Moses. I guess some of you do because you're architects. But let's just assume for a second that you don't and just enjoy this moment. So Robert Moses is this city planner, and yeah, he was the city planner of New York City back in the 20s and the 60s, and he has made a lot of big adjustments to the city. At one point, he was asked to include a particular beach that is called the Jones Beach. The Jones Beach is around northeast of New York, and it was completely disconnected with Manhattan and the rest of New York City. When he was asked to make this extension, he thought, yes, I have an idea. I know exactly how to do that. What we're going to do is we're going to build a highway that goes from New York directly out to this fantastic beach. But across the highway, I'm going to make sure that there is a bridge. And this bridge, as you can see here, is precisely, it's very short, as you can see, it is precisely 9 feet at maximum in height. Why was it that? That's because all the public buses were 9 feet and 11 inches, which means he made sure by using infrastructure that no public transportation could reach Jonas Beach. And as a small side note about Robert Moses, he was a flaming racist. He really did not like people of color and did not like Hispanic people. He didn't like anyone but the white people. And guess who takes the public transport in the 20s all the way up to the 60s? You guessed it right, minorities. So by installing this kind of bridge across the highway, he made sure that this beach stayed all white. And he was, of course, very proud. He was like, "Oh, guys, I did you a big favor." Very proud of this fantastic achievement that he made. Used architecture to make sure to filter out certain groups of people. How did this work? Well, what he did was that he removed an affordance. I just heard from Pierre that you already know what affordance means. So saying that he removed an affordance should make sense to you at this point. There is a restriction of action. And how does it, at what level does this work? It works at the societal level. Now, if we quickly move along, we did another experiment here in our lab, and in this lab, what we did was we wanted to understand how do other factors in the space affect us. So what we did was basically we had people, we exposed people to a test that is called the Trier Social Stress Test, and this kind of test is called a psychosocial stressor. And the idea behind it is that, as you can see here, there are 3 judges standing in front of you, and there's a red circle in which you have to stand. And by the way, this is all in virtual reality. That's why it looks so cartoonish. But you stand here in this red circle, and there's a microphone, and then there is a camera. And basically, what you're asked to do is that you are sitting outside here in the waiting area, and you're asked to prepare a speech for the dream job that you really want. And these are sort of already pre-programmed to be extremely negative with you, right? So you come in and you say, "Oh, I want this job because I think I'm good enough," and they go like, "Nah, not really. We don't think so." And they laugh a little bit. They're quite evil, actually. And then they say, "Okay, fine. Thank you for your speech. We have another task for you. The second task is to count backwards from 1687 in steps of 13 as fast and accurately as possible." And as you can imagine, no one has ever really been able to do that. It is a horrible experience. Also because the moment you make a mistake, they tell you, "Oh, that's wrong. Please start over." So it's super stressful. So besides, taking pleasure in torturing the students, no, that's not the only reason we did this. We also wanted to understand how did this environment affect them. So as you can see here, this was one environment is completely enclosed compared to this one. And so what we did was that while we were stressing them, we would take saliva measures. We would literally measure how much stress or how much cortisol was being produced in the spit. And we would make that measure every 10 minutes. Eventually, when we contrasted the 2 levels of cortisol between the 2 conditions, as you can see here, for the dark solid points, this is the closed group and the open group down here. You can see here that basically the cortisol levels are significantly lower in the open space compared to the closed space. And that's really interesting because no one really used it, right? No one tried to escape from these holes in the walls. They were just there. So there was like some kind of unconscious awareness about the space, about how it looks and how you can interact with it. That is, when you provide them with an affordance to escape, that affordance speaks to their fight or flight mechanism, which is affecting the cortisol production. So there's an interesting phenomenon here, right? Unconscious awareness about the environment, or sorry, unconscious attention towards the environment. And of course, we're also trying now to investigate whether what is on the other side also matters. As you probably know, there is this concept called biophilia that is a hypothesis stating that we developed in the savannah, and so natural circumstances are more appealing to us. And so we reasoned that if that was really the case, then this environment should cause an even lower stress production. But this is not something that we have concluded on yet. We're still working on it. Okay, another example on how you can use architecture to affect people's behavior. This is Chicago Lakeshore Drive, right? And basically, it's a nice and beautiful highway. You're coming down from Chicago, and you can see the beautiful skyline. And in fact, it's so beautiful, and you get so submerged, you don't realize that at the end of this highway, there's a very sharp turn, and it has resulted in many accidents. So the municipality sort of said, what can we do? How can we make it so a lot of people notice that there is a sharp turn and don't, get completely sucked into the beautiful skyline? The way they solved that was basically that in this lane in which there is a sharp turn, you can see the turn coming over here. They made sure that there are these lines on the lane in which you're driving, and these lines become closer and closer, and eventually they create this some kind of unconscious attention towards your environmental speed, because the flickering that is happening in your visual periphery around your eyes is now increasing, right? Because they're getting closer and closer. And that makes you automatically adjust your own vehicle speed because you notice this thing. Not necessarily with your awareness, it's not necessarily true that you are aware of these things, but you become attentive to them. Now, there was a group of people who thought that's an interesting phenomenon, but I wonder whether that also works for people who are walking. So this is not when you are driving, because that might just be limited to vehicle driving behavior, not to walking and locomotion behavior. So what they did in this experiment was that they had people walking down a corridor, and there were some lines on the floor, but at the back end of the wall, there was a visual attention task that they had to solve. So you have to imagine that these are the lights on the floor like this, and there are basically three different kinds of variations: large distance, medium distance, short distance. And what they find is that if you have short distance, people move significantly slower. If they have large distance between the lines, they significantly increase their velocity speed. And in fact, the results also show that if you make the task on the back wall much more difficult, then people are more susceptible to the lines. That's an interesting dynamic. There seems to be some kind of give or take relationship or balance to be weighed in this kind of phenomenon. That's also an interesting thing. So you can even take this and extend it further to animals. And I love when that happens, because that sort of speaks to the fact that this is not something that has to do with human intellect. It's not like we are reasoning that, oh, things are going faster, therefore I must slow down. No, it's much more basic. In fact, this is an experiment in which they had a bird fly through a corridor. And as you can imagine, that if this is the corridor and you have some lines on the walls, and this is basically from the bird's eye what the bird can see. So this is the wall, the left wall of the corridor, the right wall of the corridor. If you have both lines to be horizontal, following the trajectory of the flight of the bird, and this is basically the plan, you can see that the bird is basically flying at the center, more or less. Now, if you switch the right wall to a wall of vertical lines, then that is automatically attracting the bird's trajectory. And if you flip the environment, you basically flip the effect. It's fantastic. And in fact, you can also see that if you have two vertical lines on the wall, well, right and left, then they are significantly slower compared to if you have both of them being horizontal. Then they fly much faster through. That's again an amazing thing that not only works on humans, not only works on birds, but in fact also works on honeybees, as you can see here in the references. And don't worry, I will share my slides. So if anyone is interested in these experiments, you can find them and go through them. They're amazing. Okay, and I brought more gifts, more examples to make the case of how you can use architecture to affect people. Now, what you have seen here can all be captured in this concept called the adaptive unconscious. There seems to be something in our bodies, in our minds, that is noticing multiple differences in our body and in the environment, and using that to adjust to the environment correctly. So I really like Wilson, by the way, a fantastic book here called Strangers to Ourselves. I really like his definition of the adaptive unconscious. He says that adaptive unconscious are mental processes that are inaccessible to consciousness, but has an impact on decisions, feelings, and behavior. What is important to notice is that it is inaccessible to consciousness, That means, in other words, I cannot just ask you and you reply, how did you adapt to the environment? It's something that happens beyond that, right? Now, I notice also here that this is where things can get quite muddy in terms of concepts, and it's difficult to figure out when to use what word. So I'm proposing here 4 different important concepts for you to understand better what I'm talking about. The first one being the adaptive, right? That is this unconscious alignment with the world. You're basically aligning with the world. The world is changing, you align with it. The second one being the unconscious, right? The unconscious, we have to understand it as attentive but unaware. So now we have 2 other concepts that are explaining what is the unconscious. Now let's sort of try to unpack them. Attention, which is the first concept we need to unpack, is what we call the active suppression of noise. To give you an example, when you go to a party, and I know that you guys are in ETH, so you party a lot. And whenever you have a lot of there's like you're at a party and there's a lot of conversations going on around you. Yet for some reason, you have the ability to listen to the person in front of you. Even though you have a lot of noise, auditorially speaking, it should not be possible for you to decipher what is your friend telling you, but yet you have the capacity to do this cocktail party problem, as it's called. That is because attention is your ability to suppress noise around you. When I'm focusing on this cup, it's not like this cup appears more, that like sort of I'm gaining, like I'm sort of turning up how much this cup appears. No, in fact, what I'm doing is I'm turning down my context. So this appears automatically more. Now, moving along to awareness. Now, awareness is the concept we use when we say that it is something that is consciously accessible upon request. That is something I can ask you about and you can reply to me. So, to sort of again place some of these concepts in a more holistic way, I brought this example with me, this experiment, which I really, really like. So, in this experiment, there is a guy, this guy here, who's walking around campus with a map. And he's walking up to this old professor and he says, please, professor, I have class in this hall. Can you please explain to me where it is? And the moment he starts explaining to him where he has to go in the campus, there is 2 other guys here who have organized to walk right through their conversation. And when they pass with this big board, these 2 guys switch. They switch and they look at how does the professor handle the situation. Apparently he doesn't notice and he just keeps on going with the conversation. Now this is, I think, is fantastic because it sort of speaks to this relationship between attention and awareness. His task was to navigate him to another place. So he's totally engaged in this task. Then suddenly two idiots are passing through the conversation. Then he doesn't care about what this guy looks like because it's not part of the task. So to him, it's the same person. It's good enough in a sense, right? So in this case, there is a clear change in the environment, but he doesn't notice. So in my opinion, by the way, like a side note, that's why if you want to study architecture and you want to study the effects of architecture, you cannot rely on people's reports. You cannot just ask people. You need the body. And I'm bringing here, yeah, a nice quote from Jay-Z: "Women lie, men lie, but numbers don't lie." That's why I like to make measures of things. You cannot trust what people report back on their own. So sticking to this thing about the adaptive unconscious, I'm just going to quickly go through this other example because one important repercussion, one important consequence of believing in this adaptive unconscious is that the body is the key. This is where things are being noticed, things are being sort of, your body is being attentive, but it doesn't reach your awareness. So the body becomes this important holder of information. But not only holder, and that's what I'm hoping to show you with this experiment here. It doesn't just change, it doesn't just hold information, but it literally changes the way you perceive the world. And that's an important factor. So to hopefully convince you of that, I brought this example with me. This example is about some psychologists in Canada in which they wanted to understand the impact of the built environment on people's experiences. So what they did was that they had 2 groups of people. One group of people went to this very boring park in Canada, and the other group of people went to this picture, as you can see here, the suspense bridge over Capilano River in North Vancouver. Now, keep in mind, this is a suspense bridge. I mean, this is going right and left. This is how suspense bridges go, right and left. And what they had their participants do is to go out in the middle of this bridge and just stand there for 15 minutes and just observe and, just suck in what does this environment make me feel like. And then after 15 minutes, they had to come back into the mainland and write half a page about what it made them feel. The guys with the boring park had to do the same thing. As you can imagine, it was not very stimulating in the park, very stimulating here at the suspense bridge. But that was not at all what the experiment was about. And I think you have already had a bunch of different lectures before me, so you already know that psychologists, they lie a lot when they do experiments. They will just tell you all kinds of crap in order to study something else. Like, ha, we tricked you. We actually wanted to study something else. This is the same thing. In fact, what they wanted to study here was how arousal from the environment could affect your perception of the world. So how did they study it? When people were done at the suspense bridge, they had, if you were a male participant, they would make sure that you were met by a female researcher. And then she would tell the participant, oh, sorry, I really don't have time right now, but you know what? Here is my number. She would write it on a piece of paper, rip it off, and give it to him. And then she would take off. And it turns out that 9 out of 18, that's half of them, I mean, just let that sink in. Half of these people called her and called her to ask her out on a date. Nothing about the experiment. Called her out on a date compared to the other group in which it was just 2 out of 16, which is much, much, much less. And you can see here it's clearly significant. Now, I don't completely buy into this to this kind of interpretation because what the researchers what did they conclude? Well, as you can see here from the name of the paper, some evidence for heightened sexual attraction under conditions of high anxiety. Basically, they're stating that if you can put your date in a highly arousing or highly anxious state, then they will most likely mistaken or confuse that feeling of their own body for falling in love. I mean, literally, the person went from the suspense bridge, and when he reached the mainland, he was like, "Oh man, my hands are sweating, my heart is racing. What's going on?" And then he sees this beautiful researcher and he goes like, "Oh, I must be falling in love." All of this happens entirely unconsciously. Now, clearly, this is a study from the 70s. So, you know, we're not going to buy it 100% anyway, right? It's interesting. There is some evidence about this, and that's cool. Okay, so what is really, really important about this kind of experiment is that it's showing us that the brain and the body are putting things together for us without our intellectual intervenience. Like we don't have to intervene and say these two things must be matching up. That's why I'm experiencing this and that. All happens automatically. But if that is really true, then it must mean that there is something about how the body is integrating information and how my mind is experiencing the world. There must be some kind of relationship. And that's what I mean when I write something like, the mind shares first principles of biology. I mean, let's try to unpack that a little bit. And for that, I need to rely a little bit on biology and philosophy. So please hang on in here. I can make it really short. In fact, you just need to know that biology teaches us I write here two, but I'm just going to stick to the first one. One very important lesson, and that is the organism that is literally what we look like, and any other living organism, they're all physical consequences of their adaptation to environmental changes. So if the environment becomes warmer, you have less fur. If it becomes colder, you will develop more fur, right? It's simple evolution. Basically, the environment changes, you change with it. And if you then now also consider the second thing, which is that everything oscillates. That's just the nature. Nature is just like that. Just like you will find normal distributions in random places. Like this is just how nature operates. And one of them is that everything oscillates. Everything seems to have like a rhythm. Think about the way you swing your arms when you walk. Think about the way the sun turns around a much larger star and how we are turning around the star, our sun, the moon, and so on and so forth. Everything seems to have like this some kind of oscillatory being in the world. And we are no different. Our bodies, our hearts, our breath, our circadian rhythm, everything seems to be oscillating one way or another. Why is this important? Well, because if you look at that from this perspective, you need to acknowledge the process ontology, which is that everything is changing and you need to think about it as time and dynamics. The opposite of that would be what most architects are today, which is people who subscribe to substance philosophy. That is, that there exist things. Process ontology doesn't accept things. It says that nothing exists. Everything becomes. That's the idea of process philosophy. Like this cup right here, if I drop it, and I drop it again until it becomes some kind of powder, right? Because it's ceramics. Is it anymore a cup? Probably not. It has become something else. Process philosophy states that this is exactly the way the world works. There's no such thing. Everything changes. That's why I also brought my good friend Heraclitus here to say that no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man. That's just basically how this process philosophy positions human biology, but also human experience. But there is a big consequence here. If we buy into process philosophy, then we also need to accept that human experience is something that emerges through physical change. And now I want to quickly say a few things about physical change and how that relates to your experience of the world. For many, many years, cognitive science has been about this, on trying to understand how we make sense of the world, one way or another. And this old way of looking at things, I call it the old way because I like to think of myself as someone being a bit more progressive. Probably I'm not, but anyway, um, there are still a lot of researchers who build on this model that I'm showing you, which is called the passive approach, sometimes called the sandwich approach. It's called the sandwich approach because the way it's what it's basically stating is that first you perceive something, right? Could be the last cookie on a table. I perceive it. That's my perception. There's a perceptual process. Then I am thinking, you know what, I could use a cookie. I could really use some glucose right now, to stand to get through the meeting. And then eventually I make a decision and say, you know what, I'm gonna reach for it. Fuck it. Then I reach. Then there's an action. This kind of sandwich model is portraying human experience and human cognition as if it happens in different states, in different phases, independently of each other. But in fact, this has been evidenced to not be the case. What has been showed instead is that there are multiple processes going on at the same time. And this is the active approach. This is where you say, no, in fact, it does not always have to start from perception, move into cognition and then action. In fact, sometimes the act itself can be the reason that you perceive something else. And you can, in fact, show this extremely simply. If I have something behind my cup, I have to act on the cup, lift it to see something new, right? My perception changes because of my action. If I turn my head, I see a new scene. The perception have been enacted. That is the point. So you switch. You no longer think about, this black box of cognition happening and this is what you need to solve. No, in fact, just you being in the world will give you all of these things automatically. I hope this makes sense, and please, if it doesn't, then I will elaborate. With that said, I would like to make this slight transition into conscious and unconscious perception. And this is now relating to the distinction between sensation and perception. Because there is this thing called the Weber-Fechner law. I'm not going to say too much about it, but the idea here is that given that you are studying a particular phenomenon, what you need to do is to figure out the JND. The JND stands for the just noticeable difference. If you can identify the just noticeable difference for a particular phenomenon, then you can study it mathematically. That's their postulation, basically. So give you an example of that. What does that mean? I brought these two plots, one above, one below. And the big question here is which one of these two plots has the most dots? And I'm not super used to doing this virtually, but usually it's a raise of hands and stuff like that. But I just assume that you can all agree the one at the bottom has the most dots. I take it that no one disagrees. And you're absolutely right. There's a difference of 10 dots. Now, the question is, which one of these two plots has the most dots? Ha! it becomes a bit more difficult. You would have to agree, right? It's not super straightforward anymore. But difference of 10 dots, super difficult to tell the difference. So this is basically the idea. You can give people the sensations, right? I can project something, some light into your eyes and tell you and ask you about what do you perceive. But I cannot tell you exactly what you perceive because that requires your own interaction with the world, not something that I, as a researcher, can provide you. So you can do all of these things, all of these modeling work, but you will never get a proper understanding of the perception. So what can you do instead? Well, you can turn to Bayesian statistics. You can say, well, in fact, what if I use your prior information, your prior skills, your prior knowledge, and I use that information to predict whether you are able to perceive something or not. This is called Bayesian statistics because it's relying on prior knowledge, but also on probabilities. That is, I will not tell you yes or no, like in a binary way, which is what the Weber-Fechner law would do, but I will give you a probability that you would have perceived something or not. This is much better. But there is a big, big, big assumption in that, which is that you have priors that you're using to understand the world. And this has been contested by many. So to stick to still to this discussion about sensation and perception, most of you probably already know this figure. And the typical question here is that, well, as you can see, I would typically ask also, do you think that square A is darker than the square B? And most people go like, yeah, square A looks darker than square B. But in fact, if I take the pixels of square A and I compare them to the pixels of square B, they're exactly the same. That's interesting because if my perception of the world was entirely dictated by what is being projected to my eyes, then they should be equal. I should be able to tell that they are the same, but I'm not. And that has to do with the prior knowledge. Prior knowledge knowing how shadows work and how I know that that cylinder is throwing a shadow, affecting my perception, and therefore adjusting automatically for the change in color. Another example, which one of these two buses is biggest? And it's easy to see that the one in the above is for sure the largest one. But in fact, if it again was only about pixels, it's exactly the same size. But I don't perceive it like that because I have prior knowledge about how perspectives work. And I know that if they have the same size in terms of pixels, but there is a road and it's further away, then it must be bigger. That's the only way I can account for the size of it. So yes, we have, I mean, I think it's quite clear to sort of, make the assumption. I think it's fair to make the assumption that you're relying on prior knowledge and prior experience when you are perceiving the world. But it becomes even more interesting because this is where the concept of affordances comes in. Your perception of the world is the difference between sensation and perception is affordance. It is the way that you are interacting with something. That is where things become, real to you. They become meaningful. And meaningful is precisely the difference between sensation and perception. That's why for me, meaning and affordance is the same thing. It's the same thing. And I give you another example. This is like just a bunch of dots. There's no meaning here. I cannot find any meaning. It's just a bunch of dots, black square, black things on a paper. But in fact, if I show you that there is a dog, it's right there, there's a dog, and I remove the dog, the dots now have meaning. I cannot unsee it. To me now, these random dots, as they were before, they now are meaningful because I understand the affordances. Now, if you take this in architectural terms, as Elvanoe and Kevin O'Regan, I really recommend reading these two guys because it's fantastic the way they write. They're philosopher. One is a philosopher, the other is a vision neuroscientist, but they write really, really well. But they suggest that it is the continual availability of the environment that creates this experience that we have of our environment. Like literally, even though I cannot see my books in my environment right now and behind me, I know what I have to do to make them appear. I know how to act to get a perception. So that's why perception becomes this skill. It becomes this thing that you are doing. Okay, so I gave you a lot of theory about how this could work. Now I want to say a few things about how you can measure it. And now what you're looking at here is an incredibly awkward picture of myself wearing some of the equipment that we use in the lab. And basically, we integrate EEG, EEG being this electroencephalograph, measures electric activity from the brain, but not in the brain, from around the brain, from the scalp. So we have a few sensors, we place them there, and then we do some computations and try to figure out what happened in the brain. At the same time, people are wearing these VR goggles, so we have full control over the environment. And then, of course, we're using different controllers so people can interact with the different environments. With this setup, you can actually study more or less, I wouldn't say all kinds of environments, but a large part of environments. So one thing we wanted to study was the affordances in the brain. And we thought, well, how can we create a virtual environment that alters affordances systematically? So what we did was we created a space in which they had to walk from one place, one room, into another room, as you can see here. But between the spaces, there is a door. Now, the size of the door could vary. It could vary from 1.5 meters, being easily passable, to 1 meter, being somewhat passable, to 20 centimeters, being completely impossible to pass. Now, in your job, you're instructed to stand here, wait for the door to turn either green or red. That's a go or a no-go. If it turns green, you can start approaching it. And once you start approaching it, the door will slide open and there is a small red circle oscillating in the other room. And the moment you touch it, you get some, I think it was 50 cents every time you touch it. And you had 240 trials, so you can guess that that's actually quite a lot of money that we had to give them. Then you get back to the first space and you start over. What did we find? Well, obviously, first we looked at the emotions and we found that, okay, people felt less aroused for the narrow, the yellow being the narrow door, less aroused. We found that they felt far more dominated, and we also felt that they scored much lower on valence as well. What did we find in terms of the neuroscience of it? Well, what we find was that if you look at the motor cortex, the part of the brain that deals with how you move in space, even before moving, we can see that the brain is registering that there is something here I cannot pass, which is this yellow part here. This is why it's much lower. I know it doesn't look like a lot to you, but if you take the statistics of this, it shows that they are significant. And you can see over the visual cortex, it's processing this one much higher, as if there is a prediction error. It goes like, oh, error. I cannot pass this. I know I cannot pass this. It's too narrow for me to pass. And I've already tried 200 times before. What else did we find? We found that if you look at the same areas and you look at the get the go or the no go, you can see that if you only look at the go, again, they are processed significantly different from each other. So there seems to be something about the movement and the perception. What this study is suggesting is that the question about how can I act, how can I move, is asked by the brain simultaneous to the question of what do I perceive, what can I see. Suddenly, how you can act in space and what you perceive in space are no longer different processes. They are part of the same process unfolding in different areas of the brain, but they're happening at the same time. So what we studied here was the moment that they could see the doors. What happens if you start looking at while they are interacting with the doors? What we find here is that if you look at the visual cortex and you look at the motor cortex, you will find significantly different ways in which they are operating. For the visual cortex, we see what is called a alpha suppression. Alpha suppression basically means that you are seeing something, but you are suppressing a lot. That's the attention that we talked about. That means that there's a lot of information in the environment that are currently being suppressed. And it gets even worse if you start looking over the motor cortex, because you're asking people to move through a door that is impossible to pass. So you will also find very strong, as you can see here, this is very dark, very strong suppression over the motor cortex as well. Good. This is sort of all fitting into the same story, that is the importance of movement in perceiving architecture. Now, in this last study, I will run through this one very quickly, but this comes from the idea that when you walk through space, you're basically you're basically presented with new information in different velocities. So for example, if I stand in this room here, and these are plan drawings, and I'm looking into this second space, then basically I can see a lot of this space quite early in my trajectory. If I compare it to this one, then it's not until I reach the actual bending of the corner that this space appears to me. So in relatively short time, there's a lot of new information just around here. And this is basically what this simulation is showing you. It's showing you that for the soft turn, new information is coming in quite slowly. For the 45-degree turn, it's coming quite fast, but for the 90 degrees, it's coming extremely fast. And this is basically what you see here. And you have to imagine that people were walking around these, were turning these corners. And while they were turning, there were these spheres popping up right and left. And we wanted to see whether we could alter their precision and their response times depending on the corners. And now I brought also some videos here to show you what it looks like in virtual reality when you're walking. These are the different corners. So yeah, lots of small spheres popping up and you're just clicking. And what we find is that, interestingly enough, for the 90 degree, there's a nice bump up here, and this is response times on the y-axis. This is basically showing you that just around the center, this is your trajectory. Just when you reach the center, that is the actual turn, you can see a slight increase in reaction times. In other words, they got slower. If you compare that bump to the 45 degree, it is much flatter, and if you compare to the 20 degree, it's conceptually not there anymore. So that's quite interesting as well. And using this kind of measuring techniques, we actually found out that um, it is exactly at 30 degrees in which you start to compensate. So in other words, corners that are more than 30 degrees sharp are affecting your attentional resources based on our results. So how could all of this work? I'm not going to say a lot about this part here because it's very neurophysiological and not super relevant to you guys. But the takeaway message here is that it turns out that how architecture is affecting the brain is not at the higher levels. It is actually at the very fundamental low levels. And that's interesting because all our higher level cognitive processes depend on those low level processes. So that means that if architecture is affecting them down here, if you're shaking the fundament, then you're shaking the whole building. And now what we're sort of trying to do is try to understand, well, if architecture is so important to the rest of our cognitive processes, then how come no one has studied this before? How come no one has tried to understand if I change the space, how does it affect the rest of the brain? So that's basically what this slide is saying here. Moving quickly fast over into another phenomenon called serial dependence. And this is developed by my good friend and colleague, Elisabetta Canepa. I think she might have given you a talk in your course. No, no. Okay, Elisabetta Canepa, she works with atmospheres and she likes to understand how do atmospheres affect us, but not only affect me right now being in an atmosphere, but affect me as if I'm coming from one atmosphere into another. And she cleverly designed this experiment in which people had to start here, walk through a corridor, and then they had to perceive this third space. Now, the experiment was designed in such a way that space 2, as you can see here, the corridor, had different environments, different atmospheres. And these different atmospheres, her idea was that if she changed them, they would also change people's perception of the subsequent space. And so she had people walk through, go into the last space, and then they had to come back to the first space. And then that's where she asked them this critical question. Did you think that throughout walking through these different corridors, that the last space was also different? And as you can see here, the majority said yes. They thought that the subsequent space was a different space, that she had altered it some way. But in fact, she had cleverly maintained the last space static and constant. So there was never any change to the last space. Yet people perceived it as if there was a change. Some of the physiological experiments show that measurements, sorry, show that it is in particular for the dark corner. The dark corner appears to really give this effect on people. And when you compare the skin response, you can see that it's always the dark corner that is increasingly, it's very high, very high. And high skin conductance means high arousal. So in another way, you could say that high arousal changed their perception. And that is interesting because we just had an experiment in which we showed high arousal from high anxiety causes sexual attraction and so on and so forth. And I found this really incredible. Anyway, then I want to say just a few things about this concept called event cognition. And event cognition is basically building on the idea that you are segmenting your being in the world in different actions. So the best way I could sort of find to describe that is the instructions from IKEA. IKEA has like mastered the way of using these events, like critical actions, to progress in the instructions. But it's basically stating that if you are if I'm asking you right now to please tell me what you did all day, then what you will do is recap all the critical actions that you have done today. It's interesting because you will not tell me about how beautiful something is or something like that. You will tell me you will refer to to all your actions and the critical actions. I went from here to there, and then from there I went to there, and then I did this and I did that. It's always action oriented. And basically, event cognition is suggesting that these events are not only action oriented in that sense, but the space itself can introduce segmentations in your model. So you probably know this one from your own life. Like when you go from the couch into the kitchen and you go like, why did I go to the kitchen? I cannot remember. This happened quite a lot. I know that. So what they sort of studied here was try to figure out, well, does it matter that you passed through the door? And their experiment shows, and I'm going to just run quickly through this because I'm running out of time, obviously. But I'm going to send you my slides and you can read this in more detail. But essentially what they found out was that people, they tend to remember better if they do not change space. If you are taught something in one space, then you are better at recalling it in that same space. If there is a spatial shift, you tend to forget. And they think that it has to do with the fact that we have different models of the world. That is, I'm sort of creating a model in this space, and if there's a shift, then I'm creating another model. And retrieving information between models is apparently incredibly difficult. So that's probably why. Okay, conclusions. Amazing. So I gave you a lot of examples. I'm going to share the slides so you can refer back to them whenever you want. But I gave you a lot of examples coming from architectural psychology. I hope to have convinced you that we are processual organisms. And if we are really that processual, then we need to take into account how things change. And that is really how experience emerges. Then I also showed you the difference between sensation and perception, and I showed you the importance of the motor processes and affordances in creating meaning. And that all came from embodied cognitive science. And then finally, I showed you how we make measurements of these things in our lab. And we are currently working on many more experiments. So few more things are coming out very soon. Essentially, I think one of the main points that I'm trying to convey with this presentation is that you really start thinking about how things change and how you are constantly interacting and adapting to the environment. And that is really the essence of people's experience of space. It is not like there is a particular space that will always cause a particular experience. This direct relationship, this one-to-one relationship between space and experience is something that we need to kill. It's something that is a myth. It is non-scientific and nothing can back it up. There is no such thing. So I wanted just to end with this small quote that states, whosoever can shape spaces. Like literally anyone can shape a space. If you ask me, most people are interior architects themselves. Like they can change whatever they want to do. But to become an architect, you must know how to shape experiences. And I think that this is really the big difference between thinkers and designers and non-designers in that sense. So that was the last thing. Thank you for your unconscious attention.